Hello, my name is Robert Shewfelt. I'm Professor Emeritus of Food Science and Technology from the University of Georgia, and I had the pleasure of working with Alicia Ortiz Ramirez of Cornell and Andrew Clark of the University of Missouri on the book Introducing Food Science. This is the second edition. I wrote the first edition by myself and really was pleased to have help from Alicia and Andrew on this edition. What inspired me to write this book was that I was teaching an introductory course in food science, and there just wasn't anything out there that I felt was appropriate. My course was an introduction of food science for non-majors. We also had a course in majors. It's primarily designed for a non-majors course, but it may well be appropriate for a majors course as well. But I didn't have anything out there that was particularly useful, and that's why I wrote the book. I guess I like the first three chapters because the first three chapters are more written in conversational language and more for the students. Try and communicate with the students, because a lot of students have a lot of information out there that is just not all that relevant or is wrong or whatever. And so what I try to do is get in the mind of the students in those first three chapters. And then as we go on and get more technical, the next three chapters are about different types of foods: processed foods, formulated foods, chilled food, chilled and prepared foods. And most people don't really understand what a processed food is, except it's got to be bad because it's processed. Then we get into the types of activities that food scientists get into: quality assurance, product development, government and research, and I inserted a chapter there on sustainability and distribution because that's becoming more and more important in the field of food science. And then the last 5 chapters are quite a bit more technical. We get into food chemistry, into nutrition, into food microbiology, engineering, and then consumer and sensory science. And the engineering chapter particularly, I think, is a lot stronger in this book than it was in the previous. And so that's sort of the way I see the book. But the first 3 chapters are probably the most fun to work with because you have to get in the mind of students who don't necessarily have a technical background in food science. I don't know quite what the most rewarding part of writing the book is I guess is communicating ideas and trying to get in the mind of students. That's what I did as a faculty member. And I guess in this edition was easier because we had a background to start with, but to update it, to keep it fresh, and that was rewarding. I guess the most important thing is how exciting and interesting food science is. It's something that, well, my dad was a food scientist, and so I was into food science from the time I was in elementary school. All my degrees were in food science, and I love food science. And so try and communicate that enthusiasm, trying to indicate that food science is not evil people throwing chemicals into food, but in preserving our food, making sure we have a safe food supply and things like that. So that's very important to me. The primary audience obviously was the introductory food science. People that had no food science whatsoever, particularly undergraduates that might be considering food science as a major or never heard of it. They're interested in food. We're all experts in food because we eat 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day. But there's so much information out there that we don't know what really food is all about in the scientific aspects. So what I was trying to do is, again, communicate with the people who are interested in food but don't really understand or appreciate what the science aspects are. There were books out there, but the books were so technical that unless you were just really into it and had read about food science before or had a family member in food science, it was sort of, well, what does this have to do with food? And most textbooks get into in-depth in the chemistry or the microbiology before trying to explain what foods are, what processed food is, what the difference between a processed food and unprocessed food, and that's not always that easy. It seems easy, but for instance, I would have students who, when I put a label of a organic canned tomatoes on a test, they would say that wasn't processed. Well, anything that's canned is processed. But the assumption was if it's organic, it's not processed. So that whole thing is something that doesn't seem to come across in the other books. Other books are fine, but they're so technically oriented. And we are technically oriented, but if you just read the first chapter or two, you don't get the idea that this is really about food and how to understand it. And what we tried to do was start with the applied aspects first. I would hope that people who are not into food science per se, or not food science students, would get something from this book. I'm writing another book at this time, and I use this as a reference to it because I can't explain the in-depth science to them, but I think that people with a general understanding and appreciation of foods and of some science could get some benefit out of, particularly the first 9 chapters. One of the things that we did with this book that we hadn't done in the previous, 2 things. One is at the end of each chapter we have 10 discussion questions, and at least one of those questions in each chapter is quantitative, because a lot of food science professors are now saying that their students are quantitatively challenged. So we're trying to get some quantitative aspect into the book. We also, with cooperation from CRC, have put together a fairly extensive instructor's guide, which gives some information how to use the book, particularly for instructors that this wasn't their choice, but they sort of ended up teaching this type of a course. We have multiple choice questions in there. We have short answer discussion questions. We have links to websites. Some of that will become outdated, but we are working on ways to keep that fresh so we can communicate with the adopters of the textbook to communicate that. And so I think it's a very solid background, and I kind of wish that I'd had something like this when I was coming along teaching some of my undergraduate courses. One of the reasons that I think a textbook is important, particularly at the undergraduate level, is it's important to build a knowledge base, particularly when there's so much information out there that is either half true or actually false. So by building a knowledge base at the undergraduate level is important, and this book does provide a knowledge base. When I taught graduate level courses, I rarely used the textbook because I wanted to get them into the literature, and we used primary sources in the literature or some review articles. So I think that's important. A couple of the features that are in the book that I think are important is the new chapter in sustainability and distribution. That's becoming more and more important in the field. And even though some of us faculty members don't think that sustainability is all that important, the students are pushing us to consider that. And it's going to be more and more important as we go on and as we look to 10 billion people in the world by 2050. The distribution part is something that we don't teach much in food science, but I've had students come along as graduate students and for other faculty members at the University of Georgia that work primarily in thermal processing, and they end up working in the industry, fresh fruits and vegetables and distribution. And it's something that I believe needs to be taught more, and this may be the only place that gets something on distribution. So those are some of the features of the book that I think are particularly important.